The salty air of the port city, once a smell of home and her husband's return, now just tasted of loss. It seeped through the cracks in the window frame of their tiny apartment, carrying a damp chill that settled deep in Ilara's bones. Her stomach twisted, a familiar hollow ache she had been ignoring for 3 days. On the small wooden table, a single, slightly stale piece of bread lay on a chipped plate, saved for her 10-year-old son, Leo. She could hear his soft, even breathing from the alcove that served as his bedroom, the only peaceful sound in a world that had become a cacophony of worry. 6 months. 6 agonizing months since the sea, that vast, indifferent expanse of grey, had swallowed her husband's fishing boat and, with it, their future. She ran a hand over the worn fabric of her dress, her fingers tracing seams she had mended a dozen times. Her skill as a seamstress, once their bedrock, was now useless. No one had money for new clothes when they could barely afford to eat. A cold wave of dread washed over her, and she felt her heart squeeze painfully in her chest, a physical manifestation of her despair. Pinned to the door by a single, rusty thumbtack was the source of the fresh terror that kept her awake. The eviction notice. The paper felt brittle and cruel under her fingertips, the bold, black ink screaming its ultimatum. 48 hours. The numbers pulsed with a malevolent energy, a countdown to the moment she and Leo would be cast out onto the unforgiving streets. A wave of dizziness and nausea rose in her throat. She gripped the edge of the table to keep from collapsing. The world felt like it was tilting, the floorboards groaning as if they, too, were about to give way. In the corner, her sewing machine, a sturdy singer that had been her mother's, sat silent beneath a thin shroud of dust. It was a monument to a life that no longer existed, a time when its hum was a sound of hope. Now, its silence was an accusation. The wind rattled the loose window pane, a persistent, impatient sound, reminding her the outside world was waiting. She felt a tremor run through her thin frame, not from the cold, but from the bone-deep fear of absolute failure as a mother. Her entire worldly wealth lay on the peeling paint of the windowsill. $50. A worn 20. 2 10s, and 2 5s. She smoothed them out for the 10th time that hour, her fingers tracing the faded portraits as if she could somehow absorb some forgotten value from the paper. The number was an insult, a cruel joke. $50 to erase 6 months of cascading debt, to stop the clock on the eviction, to feed her growing son. It was impossible. A bitter, soundless laugh escaped her lips, more a gasp of pain than of humor. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. She closed her eyes and could almost hear the jingle of coins her husband used to pour onto this very table after a good catch, the sound of security, the smell of salt and success clinging to him. That sound had been replaced by a crushing silence, punctuated only by the harsh, demanding voice of the landlord in her memory, his words dripping with impatience. The shame was a physical sensation, a hot flush that started in her chest and spread to her ears. Pity from the baker, condescension from the grocer. Every interaction was a fresh wound. "Mama!" The voice was small, still thick with sleep, and it sliced through Ilara's spiral of despair like a knife. Leo stood in the doorway, rubbing his eyes, his dark hair a mess. He was the mirror image of his father. The sight of him was both her greatest joy and her heaviest burden. "Are we going to see the boats today?" he asked, his voice filled with a child's simple hope. Ilara felt her heart crack, a sharp, physical pain. She forced her lips into a shape that might pass for a smile, a mask of maternal calm she was an expert at wearing. "Maybe later, my love. First, breakfast." The lie tasted like ash in her mouth. She took the single piece of bread, her own hunger screaming in protest, and handed it to him. The smell of the simple loaf was intoxicating, but the sound of his happy munching was her only real sustenance. She watched him eat, memorizing the trust in his eyes. He had no idea their world was on a razor's edge. He had no idea his mother was a fraud, pretending everything was fine while their home was ripped out from under them. A tear escaped, hot and silent, and she quickly wiped it away before he could see. Ilara turned her gaze from her son to the window, looking out at the vast, grey, unforgiving sea. It had taken her husband, her love, and now it felt like it was coming for the rest. The gentle ticking of the old wall clock suddenly sounded like a drumbeat, each second a hammer blow counting down her failure. 47 hours. The phrase echoed in the hollow space behind her eyes, but beneath the suffocating blanket of despair, a tiny, cold spark of resolve began to glow. It wasn't hope. Hope was a luxury she could no longer afford. It was a grim, animalistic determination. She would not let her son sleep on the street. She would not let the world break him. The feeling of utter helplessness was a physical weight, pressing down, threatening to crush her completely. What does a person do when they have absolutely nothing left to lose? How do they find the strength to take just one more step into the suffocating darkness? If you believe that the strength of a mother's will can conquer impossible odds, subscribe now and follow Ilara's journey into the heart of the storm. You won't want to miss what she uncovers in the shadows. As Leo slept, a phantom of a memory flickered in Ilara's exhausted mind. A story her husband once told, a dismissive tale about a grandfather he never knew, a recluse, a lighthouse keeper on some forgotten island, an inheritance. The word had seemed absurd then. A piece of family lore. Now it was a splinter of wood to a drowning woman. Her heart began to beat a frantic, uneven rhythm. Was it possible? Could this fairy tale be a tangible asset? The thought was so fragile she was afraid to even breathe on it, lest it dissolve like smoke. The clock on the wall ticked, each sound a drop of water on her forehead, a constant torture. 46 hours. The desperation was a physical force, a hand on her back, shoving her towards this one. Insane, last-ditch possibility. She had to know. The alternative was a reality she refused to picture, the image of Leo's small hand in hers as they walked the cold, indifferent city streets with nowhere to go. She felt a cold sweat on her brow. It was the sweat of a gambler making their final bet. The Public Records Office was a tomb of forgotten stories, smelling of aging paper, dust, and the faint chemical scent of microfilm. The silence was thick, broken only by the rustle of turning pages and the low, monotonous hum of the overhead fluorescent lights. Ilara felt small and out of place, her worn dress a stark contrast to the sterile, bureaucratic environment. She clutched her son's hand, his warmth a small anchor in the cold sea of her anxiety. Her own hands were slick with nervous sweat as she gave the clerk her husband's name and the fragmented details she could remember. The woman behind the counter looked at her with an expression of profound boredom, her fingers tapping a slow, impatient rhythm on the Formica countertop. Every second that passed felt like a year, her hope and dread warring in her chest, creating a nauseating tension that made her feel lightheaded. She could hear the blood pounding in her ears, a frantic drumbeat accompanying the clerk's slow, deliberate search through the cavernous filing cabinets. "Here it is," the clerk's voice was flat, devoid of any emotion, making the moment feel surreal. "Storm's End Lighthouse, on Kalik Island. The deed was transferred to your late husband, and by succession, to you." The words hung in the air, unreal. Ilara stared at the official document the woman slid across the counter, her eyes struggling to focus on the intricate, archaic script. A deed. It was real, a property, a place. It wasn't a fantasy. A wave of dizziness washed over her, and she gripped the edge of the counter to steady herself. It wasn't joy that flooded her system, but a raw, primal relief, so intense it was painful. Her lungs, which had been tight with fear, suddenly expanded, and she took a deep, shuddering breath. This piece of paper was more than just a legal document. It was a lifeline, a tangible shield against the streets. Her fingers trembled as she took it, the paper feeling both impossibly flimsy and as heavy as a gravestone. She folded it carefully, a new, desperate plan taking shape in her mind. The journey to the port felt different this time. It wasn't a place of sorrowful memory, but one of frantic, uncertain purpose. The sounds of the city, the screech of tires, the distant wail of a siren, the murmur of the crowds, all seemed to be pushing her away, urging her toward the sea. She found a man named Cormac, a grizzled old boatman with eyes the color of the stormy sea and hands as gnarled as driftwood. He was mending a thick, oily net, the repetitive motion of his shuttle, the only movement in the quiet corner of the docks. When Ilara showed him the deed and asked for passage to Kalik Island, He stopped his work and squinted at her, his gaze sharp and skeptical. "Nobody's been out to Storm's End in 30 years, lady." His voice was a low growl, rough like gravel. "It's a ruin. The sea's trying to claim it." Ilara's heart sank, but she held his gaze, her desperation a silent, powerful plea. She could feel Leo shifting his weight beside her, his small body tense with a mixture of excitement and confusion. "It will take all you've got," Cormac stated, his eyes flicking down to the worn purse in her hand. The words were a sentence. Ilara didn't hesitate. She opened her purse and laid the $50, the worn 20, the 2 10s, the 2 5s, onto a weathered wooden crate between them. The money, her entire world just hours before, looked pitifully small under the grey sky. A profound sense of finality washed over her as his calloused hand swept the bills away. This was it. There was no turning back. No money for food, no money for a room if this failed. It was the lighthouse or nothing. A cold shiver that had nothing to do with the sea breeze ran down her spine. "Get in," he grunted, nodding his head toward a small, battered fishing boat that bobbed in the murky water. The boat, named the Wanderer, looked almost as derelict as he had described the lighthouse. She felt a surge of nausea, her stomach churning with fear. She took Leo's hand, her own trembling, and guided him carefully onto the rocking vessel, the world swaying beneath her feet. The small boat's engine sputtered to life with a cough of black smoke that smelled acridly of diesel and old brine. It was a jarring, mechanical sound that tore through the morning's quiet. As they pulled away from the dock, the familiar world began to shrink with an alarming speed. The sounds of the city, the clang of the shipyard, the distant horns of traffic faded away, replaced by the rhythmic slap of choppy water against the wooden hull and the lonely cry of gulls. Ilara felt a profound sense of severing, as if a thick rope connecting her to everything she had ever known had just been cut. She wrapped her arms around Leo, pulling him close, her chin resting on the top of his head. He was vibrating with excitement. But for Ilara, the growing distance between the boat and the shore felt like a physical chasm opening up inside her chest. She was truly adrift now, a refugee fleeing a life that had collapsed into dust, sailing toward a myth she had paid for with her last $50. The risk of it all was a cold, hard stone in her stomach. An hour passed. The mainland was now just a faint, dark line separating the grey sea from the grey sky. The immensity of the ocean was overwhelming. There was nothing in sight but churning water, a vast, indifferent wilderness. The feeling of isolation was no longer a creeping dread. It was a heavy blanket, suffocating and cold. The salt spray misted Ilara's face, cold and biting, and she could taste it on her lips, the taste of her husband's work, the taste of her loss. Her stomach churned with the boat's rocking motion, and she fought back a wave of seasickness. "Are we almost there?" Leo asked, his initial excitement beginning to wane, replaced by a child's impatience. Cormac just grunted from the stern, his hand steady on the tiller, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Ilara scanned the endless water, her heart pounding. What if there was nothing there? What if the island itself was just a story, a cartographer's mistake? The doubt was a poison, seeping into the fragile hope she had so carefully constructed. Her breath hitched in her throat. Then Cormac pointed with his chin. "There she is, Cailleach." At first, Ilara saw nothing. Then she spotted it. A tiny, dark speck on the horizon, like a fleck of soot on a vast, grey canvas. As they drew closer, the speck grew, slowly taking shape. It was an island, but not the gentle, welcoming kind she had imagined. It was a jagged fang of dark rock jutting out of the angry sea, its shores a chaotic jumble of stone. And atop its highest point, a thin, skeletal needle rose against the overcast sky, the lighthouse. Storm's End. The name suddenly felt less like a poetic title and more like a literal warning. The sound of the waves crashing against the rocks grew from a distant murmur to a thunderous, violent roar. The boat began to rock more violently as they entered the turbulent waters surrounding the island. Ilara's stomach dropped, a sickening lurch of fear and dawning disappointment. This place did not look like a sanctuary. It looked like the end of the world. Leo, sensing her sudden tension, grew quiet and pressed closer against her side. "This is as far as I go," Cormac yelled over the roar of the surf, cutting the engine. The boat bobbed precariously 20 feet from a small, slimy-looking jetty that was barely more than a few rocks and rotting planks. The currents'll tear the bottom out of my boat if I get any closer. The prospect of clambering onto the slippery rocks with Leo was terrifying. Ilara felt a surge of panic, but there was no choice. Cormac tossed a wet, thick rope onto the jetty, and with a strength that belied her thin frame, Ilara managed to secure it. She passed Leo over first, her heart in her throat as he scrambled onto the slick, seaweed-covered stone. Then she followed, her worn shoes finding no purchase. She slipped, her knee cracking hard against the rock, sending a jolt of sharp pain up her leg. She ignored it, hauling herself up, her hands scraped and bleeding. By the time they were both safely on the jetty, Cormac had already started his engine. He didn't wave or say goodbye. The sound of his motor faded quickly, leaving them in a silence that was absolute, broken only by the crash of the waves and the cry of the wind. And then she truly saw it. The hope she had nurtured for the past few hours shattered like fragile glass against stone. The lighthouse wasn't just old or neglected. It was a corpse. A skeletal tower of crumbling grey stone that seemed to lean into the wind as if exhausted from its long, losing battle with the elements. It looked impossibly tall and fragile, a monument to decay. Ilara felt the air leave her lungs in a painful rush. This was not a solution. This was a new, more profound kind of prison. A wave of nausea, sharp and acidic, rose in her throat. The cold, hard knot of despair that had been in her stomach dissolved into a sick, spreading dread that chilled her to the bone. She had failed, utterly and completely. She had traded a tiny, warm apartment for this desolate rock, this monument to ruin. The wind whipped a strand of hair across her face, stinging her eyes, which were already beginning to burn with unshed tears of pure, unadulterated horror at the magnitude of her mistake. As they stumbled up the rocky path toward the tower, the smell hit them. It was a physical assault, a thick, suffocating miasma that clawed at the back of their throats. It was the smell of a century of abandonment, a nauseating blend of pervasive, earthy mold, the sharp, briny stench of salt and damp decay, and the acrid, metallic tang of rust. Beneath it all was the pungent odor of generations of seabirds, their droppings caked white and grey over every surface. Leo buried his face in Ilara's coat, letting out a small, choked cough. "It stinks." "Mama?" Ilara couldn't answer. She felt her own stomach roil, and she had to swallow hard to keep from being sick. The air here felt heavy and diseased, as if the very atmosphere of the island was saturated with neglect and sorrow. Each breath was an effort, filling her lungs not with life-giving oxygen, but with the foul evidence of their new, desperate reality. The smell was a declaration. Nothing lived here, and nothing was welcome. They reached the base of the tower. The massive wooden door, which should have been a symbol of security, was a mockery of one. It hung drunkenly from a single, grotesquely twisted iron hinge, its wood splintered and greyed by the relentless salt and wind. It groaned and scraped against the stone threshold with every gust, a constant, mournful sound like a creature in pain. Ilara looked up, her neck craning to see the top of the tower. The great lantern room, which should have housed a powerful, life-saving light, was a gaping black maw. The intricate framework of the glass was still there, but every single pane had been shattered, leaving behind a jagged, skeletal crown. It looked like a blinded eye socket, staring sightlessly out at the hostile sea. The iron catwalk that circled it was a fringe of rust-eaten lace, sections of it having broken away and fallen, leaving terrifying gaps. It was a place where safety had died long ago. With a deep, shuddering breath, Ilara pushed the groaning door open. The sound was a screech of tortured metal and wood that echoed into the cavernous space within. The interior was even more catastrophic than the exterior had promised. Darkness and damp clung to everything. The circular room was a scene of total devastation. Large puddles of stagnant, brackish water covered more than half of the flagstone floor, reflecting the grey light from the doorway in murky, shifting patches. The wind didn't just howl outside, it screamed through dozens of cracks in the stonework, creating a disorienting, whistling symphony of desolation. Piles of debris, rotted wood, fallen plaster, and unidentifiable filth were heaped in the corners. In the absolute center of this chaos stood a single, incongruous object. A large, pot-bellied cast-iron stove, its surface a uniform coat of deep orange rust. A rat, disturbed by their entrance, suddenly darted from behind it, its tiny claws making a frantic scratching sound on the stone before it vanished into a crack in the wall. Leo let out a small, frightened whimper and clung to her leg, his small body trembling. The sound broke through Ilara's horrified paralysis. This wasn't a home. It was a tomb, a cold, wet grave on a rock in the middle of nowhere. The last, fragile flicker of hope she had clung to during the boat ride was violently extinguished, leaving behind nothing but an aching, hollow void. The cold of the damp flagstones seemed to leach up through the thin soles of her shoes, seeping into her very bones, a physical manifestation of her utter defeat. She had spent their last dollar, their last chance, to bring her son to this abyss. The weight of her failure was a physical pressure, crushing the air from her lungs, making it impossible to breathe. She had promised to protect him, and instead, she had led him to a place even more dangerous and desolate than the streets they had fled. The isolation was absolute. No one knew they were here. No one was coming for them. Her knees buckled. Ilara sank down onto the cold, grimy stone floor, the fight finally leaving her. The sharp pain from her bruised knee was a distant, unimportant sensation compared to the agony in her soul. She looked around at the ruin, at the water, at the darkness, and a sob tore itself from her throat, raw and ragged. Hot tears she thought she had no more of began to stream down her face, carving clean paths through the grime on her cheeks. She pulled Leo into her lap, holding him so tightly he grunted in protest, burying her face in his hair so he wouldn't see her brokenness. But he could feel it. He could feel the shudders that racked her body. The howling wind was the only other sound, a wild, mocking laugh at her folly. Here, in the belly of Storm's End, surrounded by decay and the roaring sea, Ilara felt something inside her snap. It was the final thread of her spirit. She had reached the bottom, a place of cold, wet stone and a darkness far deeper than the shadows filling the room. She was utterly, completely, and finally lost. As the grey afternoon bled into a cold, starless twilight, the single object that commanded Ilara's attention was the rusty cast-iron stove. It was their only bastion against the encroaching, bone-deep chill that seeped through the stone walls of the lighthouse. The wind, no longer just a mournful howl, had become a physical assailant, rattling the broken door and finding every crack to whistle through with a high, thin shriek. Ilara held Leo close, his small body a fragile source of warmth against hers, his soft breaths a stark contrast to the violence of the storm outside. She felt the cold as a physical weight pressing down on her spirit. To her utter shock, when she had first unlatched the stove's small iron door, she had found it wasn't empty. It was neatly stacked to the brim with freshly cut, perfectly dry firewood. It made no sense. It was a small, impossible miracle in a place of profound neglect, a baffling act of kindness in the heart of desolation. Her mind, weary from despair, couldn't even begin to process the incongruity of it. The first log caught with a reluctant crackle, the tiny flame struggling for life before it greedily consumed the dry kindling and licked at the larger piece of wood. A deep, earthy and resinous scent filled their small corner of the ruin, the smell of pine and dry timber a stark and welcome contrast to the pervasive stench of mold and decay. Ilara and Leo huddled as close as they dared, stretching their numb fingers toward the growing heat. The stove's rusted surface began to glow a deep, cherry red, radiating a circle of precious warmth that pushed back the oppressive damp and the biting cold. For the first time since arriving on this desolate rock, a flicker of something other than terror stirred in Ilara's chest. It wasn't hope, not yet, but the simple, animal comfort of warmth. The firelight threw dancing, distorted shadows on the crumbling walls, making the ruin feel less like a tomb and more like a primitive cave. They ate nothing, but the warmth in their bellies was a kind of sustenance in itself, a temporary reprieve. The night wore on, a long, dark stretch of time, measured only by the crackle and hiss of the burning logs and the relentless symphony of the storm. One by one, Ilara fed the pieces of wood into the stove's hungry maw, each one a small sacrifice to keep the freezing darkness at bay. She watched the flames, mesmerized, their hypnotic dance a distraction from the terror of their situation. Leo had finally succumbed to exhaustion, falling into a deep sleep curled at her side, his face peaceful in the flickering orange light. Ilara felt a pang of love so fierce it was painful. She stroked his hair, her heart aching. But as the pile of wood dwindled, her anxiety returned, coiling in her gut. Soon, the last log would turn to ash, and the cold, which waited just beyond their small circle of light like a patient predator, would reclaim its territory. The thought was unbearable. Finally, the fire sputtered its last, and a profound, chilling darkness and silence fell over the room, broken only by the wind's lonely cry through the shattered lantern room far above. Ilara must have drifted into a state of shivering, semi-conscious exhaustion because she awoke with a violent shudder. The cold was absolute, a physical presence that had seeped into her bones while she slept. Her teeth were chattering uncontrollably, and she could see her own breath pluming in the pre-dawn gloom. Leo was a tight, shivering ball beside her, his face pale. The stove was a block of inert, cold iron, panic, cold and sharp, pierced through her stupor. They wouldn't survive another day, another night like this. Her first thought was of the wood, the memory of its warmth, a cruel taunt. Driven by a desperate, irrational sliver of a wish, she crawled over to the stove. Her fingers, numb and clumsy, fumbled with the cold iron latch. She steeled herself for the emptiness, for the sight of grey ash that would confirm their hopeless fate. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, painful rhythm. She pulled the small door open, the creak of the hinge unnaturally loud in the profound silence of the tower's interior. She stared, her mind refusing to comprehend what her eyes were seeing. It was full. The stove was once again neatly stacked with dry, pale firewood. The logs were perfectly arranged, just as they had been before. It was impossible. She hadn't dreamed it. She had burned every last piece herself. A tremor that had nothing to do with the cold ran through her entire body. She reached out a trembling hand and touched the wood. It was real. It was solid and dry and cool to the touch. It smelled faintly of pine. Her breath hitched in her throat, a strangled gasp of disbelief and a new, creeping fear. Her gaze darted around the dark, empty room. They were alone on this rock. Cormac was long gone. No boats could have landed in last night's storm. A wave of icy dread washed over her, far colder than the air. A single question screamed in the silence of her mind. Who was here? A ghost or something else? Something that could move silently through a raging storm and perform this impossible act of provision. A single tear of pure confusion and fear rolled down her cheek, freezing almost instantly. She slammed the stove door shut, the clang echoing like a gunshot in the cavernous room. The sound startled Leo awake. "Mama, are you okay?" he whispered, his voice small and frightened. Ilara couldn't speak. She could only shake her head, pulling him into a fierce hug. This changed everything. They were not simply battling the elements. They were not alone. The presence of an unknown entity, whether benevolent or malevolent, was a far more terrifying prospect than the storm. Every creak of the old tower, every whistle of the wind, now sounded like a footstep, a breath. The isolation she had felt before was replaced by the terrifying sensation of being watched. Her survival instinct, honed to a razor's edge by the past few days, shifted its focus. The primary threat was no longer starvation or hypothermia. It was the mystery. A chilling resolve settled in her heart. She would not be a passive victim in this strange, terrifying play. She had to know. That night, she feigned sleep. After feeding the stove with the phantom wood until a comfortable warmth filled their corner, she lay down beside Leo, matching her breathing to his deep, rhythmic slumber. But her mind was a whirlwind of alert, panicked energy. Her eyes were shut, but her ears were straining, trying to pass every sound that filtered through the stone walls. The storm had subsided, leaving behind a world of eerie quiet, punctuated by the rhythmic, heavy crash of waves on the rocks below and the distant, mournful cry of a lone gull. The silence inside the tower was even more profound. It was a heavy, listening silence, and Ilara felt as if she were a part of it, a taut string waiting to be plucked. She felt every beat of her own heart as a loud, betraying drum in her chest. Every nerve in her body was on fire, waiting. She had to stay awake. She had to confront the source of this impossible charity, to look her ghost in the eye. She wouldn't let this island's secrets toy with her. The fear was a cold knot in her stomach, but beneath it was a burning, defiant curiosity. Hours crawled by. The fire in the stove dwindled to glowing embers, and the chill began to creep back into the air, a familiar, unwelcome visitor. Ilara's body ached with the effort of remaining perfectly still, her muscles screaming in protest. Her eyelids felt as heavy as stones, and she had to fight a constant, desperate battle against the pull of sleep. She was on the verge of giving up, of dismissing the morning's discovery as a hallucination brought on by cold and hunger, when she heard it. It was a sound so faint, so subtle, that at first she was certain she had imagined it. A soft, dry scrape. It was nothing like the groan of wood or the whistle of wind. It was a deliberate sound, low and secretive. It came from somewhere beneath her, from the very stones of the floor. She held her breath, her entire being focused on that one sense, hearing. The sound stopped. The silence that rushed back in was heavier, more charged than before. Had she dreamed it? Was her exhausted mind finally cracking under the strain? Then it came again, a little louder this time, more distinct. Scra-up, grurind. It was the unmistakable sound of stone rubbing against stone. A cold jolt, sharp and electric, shot through Ilara's body, erasing all traces of exhaustion. It was real. The sound was coming from directly beneath the cast-iron stove. Her heart, which had been a slow, heavy drum, began to hammer against her ribs, a frantic, panicked bird trapped in a cage. She slowly, silently, pushed herself up from the floor, her movements as fluid and quiet as a cat. Leo didn't stir. The scraping sound continued, rhythmic and methodical, as if someone or something was working at a slow, patient task in the foundations of the tower itself. An image of long, skeletal fingers clawing at the stone from below flashed in her mind, and a wave of pure, primal terror threatened to overwhelm her. She clamped her teeth together to keep from crying out, forcing the fear down. She had to see. She had to know what was making that terrible, secret sound in the dead of night. She crept forward, placing her bare feet carefully on the coldest parts of the flagstones to avoid making a sound. The floor was icy, the cold a sharp shock to her system, but she barely registered it. All of her focus was on the stove, which now seemed like a dark, squat idol, guarding a terrible secret. As she drew closer, the sound abruptly stopped. The sudden, absolute silence was more terrifying than the noise had been. It was an expectant silence, a listening silence. It knew she was there. A shiver traced its way down her spine, and the fine hairs on her arms stood on end. She froze, her breath caught in her throat, her ears straining. Nothing, only the distant, sighing crash of the waves. Was it waiting for her? A new, colder fear washed over her. The feeling of being watched was no longer a vague paranoia. It was a certainty. She felt unseen eyes on her from the shadows, from the very stones beneath her feet. The lighthouse was not abandoned. It was inhabited, and it was awake. She was a trespasser in a place that held its breath, waiting for her next move. Taking a shuddering breath to steady her nerves, Ilara dropped to her hands and knees. The cold of the stone was brutal, seeping instantly through the thin fabric of her dress, but her mind was too consumed by the mystery to care. She began to examine the floor around the base of the stove, her trembling fingers tracing the dark grout lines between the massive, uneven flagstones. The stones were slick with a thin film of damp grime, and she could feel the grit under her fingernails. She ran her hands over every inch of the surface, pressing down, searching for any give, any irregularity. It was like reading a map in the dark, her sense of touch her only guide. The air was thick with tension, her own ragged breathing the only sound in the suffocating stillness. She felt a surge of desperate frustration. Had she imagined it all? Was this just another dead end? Another false hope in this endless labyrinth of despair? Her heart sank. The silence felt like a mockery, laughing at her for believing in ghosts and secret sounds. The tower was just a ruin, and she was just a fool. And then her fingers brushed against it. A subtle, almost imperceptible difference. Under the front right leg of the heavy stove, one of the grout lines felt wider, filled not with hard mortar but with soft, crumbly dirt. Her heart gave a painful lurch. She pressed down on the edge of the flagstone next to it. It shifted. It was only a millimeter, a tiny, rocking movement, but it was unmistakable. It was a loose stone. It was the source. A jolt of triumphant adrenaline surged through her, momentarily eclipsing her fear. It wasn't a ghost. It was a door, a secret. Her mind raced. The firewood, the sound. It all led to this single, movable piece of the floor. This was the heart of the mystery. The scraping sound must have been someone or something on the other side, either trying to get out or trying to secure it from below. Her hands were shaking so badly she had to press them flat against the floor to still them. This was it, the moment that would change everything. The point of no return, the secret of Storm's end was waiting for her, just beneath her fingertips. She needed leverage. The stone was massive, and the stove was partially on top of it. She scanned the debris-strewn room, her eyes adjusting to the deep gloom. She spotted a long, thin piece of rusted metal, part of the shattered lantern room's frame that had fallen all the way to the ground floor. It was perfect. She grabbed it, the cold, rough rust biting into her palms. Using it as a crowbar, she wedged the tip into the crack she had found and put her entire weight on it. For a moment, nothing happened. The metal groaned in protest. Then, with a horrible, grating screech that sent shivers down her spine, the stone began to move. It scraped against its neighbors, the sound 100 times louder than the phantom noises she had heard earlier. It was the sound of a tomb being opened. She heaved again, sweat beading on her forehead despite the cold, her muscles straining. The flagstone, thick and heavy as a gravestone, slowly tilted upwards, revealing a square of perfect, impenetrable blackness beneath. A wave of air washed up from the opening, and it was utterly different from the damp, salty air of the tower. It was a dry, cool, and ancient smell. It smelled of deep earth, of dust that had lain undisturbed for decades, of stone that had never seen the rain. It was the scent of a sealed place, a pocket of time that had been hidden away from the world. The absence of the smell of mold and decay was the most shocking thing of all. Ilara peered into the darkness, but it was absolute. A void that seemed to swallow the faint grey light of the room. A cold, primitive fear of the dark, of the unknown spaces of the earth, gripped her. This was no cellar. This was something else. The opening revealed the top of a set of narrow, steep steps, carved directly out of the stone foundation, descending into the abyss. They were less a staircase and more a ladder, plunging straight down into the heart of the island. A new question, more terrifying than any before, Anne formed in her mind. What kind of person builds a secret staircase to nowhere in the middle of a lighthouse? She needed light. The embers in the stove were all but dead. Thinking fast, she grabbed one of the unburnt logs from her precious, mysterious supply. It felt like sacrilege to use it for anything but warmth, but the need to know what lay below was a fire far hotter than any fear of the cold. She used a splinter of wood to carry a glowing coal from the stove's ashpan and touched it to the resinous end of the log. After a few tense moments of blowing on the ember, a small, sputtering flame erupted, casting a weak, flickering orange glow. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Holding her makeshift torch aloft, she felt her resolve harden. She had come this far. She could not turn back now. Whatever secret this lighthouse held, it was tied to her survival, to the strange gifts of wood. It could be the answer to everything, or it could be her doom, but she could not live another moment in ignorance. Taking a deep, shuddering breath that tasted of dust and old secrets, she swung her legs over the edge and began her descent. The steps were narrow and steep, slick with a fine layer of dust but mercifully dry. Her torch cast wild, dancing shadows that leaped and writhed on the stone walls, transforming the confined space into a gallery of monsters. Her own shadow was a giant, hunched creature that followed her down into the depths. The air grew cooler and stiller with each step, the sounds of the sea and wind fading away completely until all she could hear was the frantic pounding of her own heart and the sound of her own breathing, which echoed unnaturally in the confined passage. The stone walls were cool and rough against her free hand, which she used to brace herself. The descent felt endless, as if she were climbing down the throat of some long-dead beast. She felt a profound sense of disconnection from the world above, from the light, from Leo. She was entering a different realm now, a place that had been deliberately forgotten. She counted the steps, a small, mindless ritual to keep the rising panic at bay. 21, 22, 23. Finally, her foot touched a flat, level surface. She had reached the bottom. She held her torch high, her eyes widening as the flickering light revealed the space around her. She was standing in a large, circular chamber, its walls lined with old, weathered red bricks. It was a cistern, the vast, dry reservoir that must have once held the lighthouse's supply of fresh water. But it had been dry for a very long time. The air was perfectly still, and the silence was absolute, a heavy, pressing weight that felt older than the tower itself. It was a secret room, a hidden heart buried in the island's rock, protected from the ravages of the sea and the sky. It was a place of perfect preservation, and it was not empty. Her torchlight glinted off something dark and angular in the center of the room. She took a tentative step forward, her heart in her throat, the torch held out in front of her like a weapon. The light fell upon a neat, deliberate stack of objects that did not belong in a cistern. They were man-made, and they were waiting. There were 4 of them. Large, dark green, waterproofed military trunks, the kind used to transport equipment or sensitive materials. They were stacked 2 by 2, their formidable steel latches and reinforced corners giving them an air of grim, official purpose. They looked completely out of place in this ancient stone chamber, an intrusion from a more modern, more brutal world. This was no pirate's hoard or forgotten family treasure. This was something else entirely. The open loops in Ilara's mind connected with a terrifying jolt. The firewood, the secret entrance, the hidden chamber. It all led to this. This was the secret the mysterious visitor was protecting, or hiding. A shiver of deep foreboding ran through her. These trunks were not filled with hope or salvation. They radiated a cold aura of danger. She could feel it. She could almost smell it, a faint, metallic scent of menace beneath the dust. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that she should turn around, climb back up the stairs, and pretend she had never found this place. But she couldn't. The need to know was a physical compulsion, an itch in her soul that had to be scratched. She knelt before the top trunk, her torch placed on the floor beside her, its light casting a low, dramatic glow. The steel latches were cold and stiff under her fingers. They were not locked, but they were sealed tight against the damp. She had to use the end of her rusted metal bar to pry the first one open. It resisted, and then with a loud, sudden snap that echoed like a gunshot in the silent cistern, the latch sprang free. She did the same with the second. Her heart was pounding so hard she felt dizzy. She paused, her hands hovering over the lid. Her mind a maelstrom of fear and anticipation. Gold, weapons, bones. Taking one last, ragged breath, she gripped the handle and heaved the heavy lid open. It swung upwards with a low groan, revealing the contents within. No glint of gold, no hoard of jewels. Her torchlight fell upon a neatly packed interior, but it was a treasure of a different, more complex kind. The trunk was filled to the brim with paper. The top layer consisted of dozens of identical, leather-bound books, their dark brown covers worn smooth with time and handling. They looked like ledgers or journals, their spines unmarked. The air filled with the rich, musty scent of old paper and aging leather, a smell like a forgotten library. Beneath the journals, she could see stacks of official-looking documents, bound with faded red ribbon, their pages covered in typed script and formal signatures. And tucked into the corners were small, metal canisters, the kind used to hold rolls of photographic film negatives. Ilara reached in with a trembling hand and picked up the topmost journal. The leather felt cool and supple beneath her fingers. It was heavy, filled with a story. She felt an overwhelming sense of gravity, of stepping across a threshold into a history that was never meant to be unearthed. This was not a treasure to be spent. It was a history to be reckoned with. It was evidence, a horrifying secret, perfectly preserved, waiting in the dark, silent heart of Storm's End. With her torch casting a nervous, flickering light, Ilara sat on the cold brick floor of the cistern and opened the first journal. The leather cover was smooth and cool, worn down by the passage of decades. The air grew thick with the scent of old paper, a smell both academic and funereal. Her heart pounded a slow, heavy rhythm against her ribs, a drumbeat of dread in the profound, subterranean silence. She opened to the first page. The handwriting was neat, elegant, the ink a faded blue-black. It was the script of a man of patience, a man of order. The first entry was dated nearly 40 years ago. As she began to read the words written by her husband's grandfather, a man she had never known, she felt an icy knot of foreboding tighten in her stomach. She felt like an intruder, a grave robber of memories, but an undeniable force compelled her to turn the page. The truth of Storm's End was written here, in this forgotten ink, and she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the very marrow of her bones, that her life was about to be irrevocably split into two parts. The time before she opened this book, and everything that would come after. The words described the mundane life of a lighthouse keeper, the weather, the tides, the maintenance of the great lamp. But then the tone shifted. An entry from a cold November evening spoke of a visit, a boat that wasn't a fishing vessel. Captain Alistair Correa of the Army came today, the entry read. He informed me of a new directive, a matter of national security. My lighthouse is to be a way station. He was very persuasive. He said my cooperation was not a request, it was a patriotic duty. A shiver, cold and sharp, traced its way down Ilara's spine. She read on, her eyes flying across the page. A few nights later, the first boat arrived after midnight. No lights. I heard the engine cut, then voices, low and urgent. They brought 3 people. I was instructed to log their arrival. No names, just numbers. They were taken into the lower storage room. I heard nothing after that. Before dawn, the boat left. The storage room was empty. Ilara's breath hitched in her throat. She looked around the brick-lined cistern. This was the lower storage room. She was sitting in the middle of a secret prison. She grabbed another journal, and then another, her hands shaking so badly she could barely turn the brittle pages. The elegant handwriting of the early entries grew progressively more frantic, the neat lines devolving into a spiky, desperate scrawl that tore at the paper. He had stopped using numbers and started writing names. The pages were filled with them, a horrifying, endless list. Elena Petrova, 28, teacher. Javier Rojas, 19, student. Samuel Costa, 52, journalist. Each name was followed by a date, and sometimes a single, heartbreaking detail. Wore a yellow scarf. Was carrying a book of poetry. Asked for water. Ilara felt a wave of nausea rise in her throat. These were not just names. They were ghosts. They were the stories of lives stolen in the dead of night. Their final moments recorded by a guilt-ridden keeper forced into complicity. She could feel their presence in the cold, still air of the cistern, a silent chorus of the disappeared. Her own suffering, her hunger and fear felt small and insignificant in the face of this monumental, hidden atrocity. Her trembling fingers found a bundle of documents tied with a faded red ribbon that crumbled to dust at her touch. The top sheet was crisp, official, bearing the seal of the nation's military regime. The cold, bureaucratic language was more chilling than any emotional confession. Transfer order, subversive elements. It detailed the process for moving political prisoners to undisclosed locations for interrogation and processing. Her eyes scanned the page until they landed on a signature at the bottom, scrawled with arrogant confidence. Captain Alistair Correa. It was him. He was the architect of this horror. Another document was a log sheet, matching the names in the journal to prisoner numbers. A cold accounting of human lives. Attached to it was a direct order, signed by Correa, authorizing the use of maritime disposal for prisoners processed at Sector 7. The code name for Storm's End, maritime disposal. The phrase was so clinical, so sterile, it meant he had ordered them thrown into the sea that had taken her husband. A violent tremor racked Ilara's body. She fumbled for one of the small metal canisters, prying the lid off with her numb fingers. A tightly wound roll of film negatives was inside. She pulled out a strip and held it up to the wavering light of her torch. The images were grainy, dark, and filled with motion blur, but they were undeniable. The silhouette of a man being dragged from a boat, his arms held by two uniformed figures. A small group of people huddled on the rock jetty, their faces obscured by shadows, their bodies slumped in defeat. They were faceless specters, visual proof of the grandfather's horrific text. The truth settled upon Ilara, not like a revelation, but like a shroud. The old keeper hadn't been a monster. He had been a prisoner himself, trapped by a monster. This cistern, these trunks, this was his confession, his penance, his desperate, meticulous archive of a crime, created in secret and preserved against the odds. It was a ticking time bomb he had buried in the heart of the island, a testament of truth waiting for someone to finally light the fuse, the firewood. It was a guardian watching over this tomb. The name echoed in the silence of the cistern, a serpent uncoiling in her mind. Alistair Correa, she had heard it before. The realization dawned slowly, a sickening sunrise of dread. In the port city, on posters peeling from brick walls, on a discarded newspaper she had seen just before leaving, General Alistair Correa, a politician, a charismatic figure with a decorated military past, now running for a major national office. He was a hero to some, a man promising to restore order and strength to the country. Her blood ran cold. The captain who signed death warrants in the dark was now a celebrated public figure, stepping into the light, seeking ultimate power. The secret she held in her hands was not a piece of history. It was a live wire, connected directly to one of the most powerful men in the country. The danger was not past. It was present. It was potent. A new kind of fear, colder and more intelligent than her earlier despair, took root in her soul. She was no longer just a victim of circumstance. She was the keeper of a truth that could get her killed. A week bled into the next. Ilara and Leo survived in a strange limbo. A life measured by the mysterious deliveries of firewood and the careful rationing of the stale bread she had brought. The discovery in the cistern had transformed her. The hollow-eyed desperation was gone, replaced by a sharp, humming vigilance, the alertness of an animal guarding its young. She felt the weight of the trunks directly beneath her feet with every step she took, a constant, heavy pressure on her soul. She moved the flagstone back, concealing the entrance, trying to erase any sign of her discovery. She played with Leo on the rocks. She told him stories by the fire, but it was all a performance. A part of her mind was always down below, in the cold, silent dark, standing guard over the ghosts of the disappeared. Her heart existed in a perpetual state of arrhythmia, fluttering with anxiety every time the wind changed direction or a boat appeared on the distant horizon. The isolation of the island was no longer a curse. It had become a fragile, temporary shield. Then, one afternoon, the shield was shattered. Over the rhythmic crash of the waves, a new sound intruded, a deep, powerful thrum. It was the engine of a modern speedboat, confident and aggressive, and it was heading directly for their island. Panic, sharp and electric, seized Ilara. Her heart hammered against her ribs. This wasn't the chugging motor of a friendly fishing boat. This was the sound of purpose, of wealth, of power. She grabbed Leo's hand, her grip so tight he let out a small yelp, and pulled him behind a crumbling section of the inner wall, her body instinctively forming a barrier. "Stay quiet," she whispered, her voice tight with terror. Her mind raced. Was this the guardian, the firewood provider, finally showing himself? Or was it something else? Something drawn by the rumors of the lighthouse's new inhabitants. The engine noise grew louder. then abruptly cut. Silence descended, thick and expectant. They were here. A cold sweat beaded on Ilara's forehead, her breath catching in her throat. A voice called out, and the sound made the fine hairs on Ilara's arms stand on end. "Hello? Anyone home?" The voice was not rough or menacing. It was smooth, cultured, and carried an easy authority that cut through the whistling wind. It was the voice of a man who was accustomed to being answered. Ilara held her breath, pressing a hand gently over Leo's mouth. He looked up at her, his eyes wide with confusion and fear. She risked a glance through a narrow crack in the crumbling mortar. On the small jetty where she and Leo had scrambled ashore, a man was tying off a sleek, expensive-looking boat. He was tall, impeccably dressed in a tailored jacket that seemed utterly alien to the rugged island. He had a full head of distinguished silver hair and a face that was handsome in a severe, patrician way. He stood for a moment, scanning the tower with a proprietary air, his posture radiating an unshakable confidence. Ilara felt a chill of recognition, a dread so profound it felt like a physical blow. Her blood turned to ice water in her veins. It was him, the face from the campaign posters, from the television news segments she had glimpsed in shop windows. General Alistair Correa, the beloved war hero, the political frontrunner, the captain, the man whose signature was a death sentence, the monster from the journals. The world tilted, the crumbling stone walls seeming to spin around her as a wave of vertigo and terror washed over her. He was not a ghost of the past. He was here, in the flesh, standing on her island. How? How could he know they were here? The questions swirled in her panicked mind, but one terrible certainty rose above the chaos. He had come for his secret. He had come to ensure the tomb he had created 40 years ago remained sealed forever. The sleeping dragon she had felt beneath her feet was not only awake, it had climbed out of its lair and was walking toward her door. Her body trembled, a primal, uncontrollable reaction to the presence of a predator. He strode up the rocky path with the easy gait of a landowner surveying his property. He didn't bother to knock on the splintered, broken door, but stepped directly inside, his sharp, intelligent eyes taking in the scene of squalor in a single, sweeping glance. He saw Ilara and Leo huddled behind the wall. A smile played on his lips, but it did not reach his eyes. They were cold, calculating, and they missed nothing. "Ah, there you are," he said, his voice a rich baritone that filled the cavernous space. "My apologies for the intrusion. My name is Alistair Correa. I was informed this old lighthouse finally had new tenants." The casual lie was delivered with practiced perfection. He knew exactly who she was. Ilara felt a surge of adrenaline. This was a performance, a chess match, and he had just made the opening move. The air crackled with unspoken tension. The space between them charged with the history buried beneath the floor. Her fear was a physical thing, a hand squeezing her heart, but a cold, hard defiance began to form in its place. She forced her frozen limbs to move, pushing herself to her feet and gently guiding Leo behind her back. She was a wall, a shield, a mother protecting her cub. Her heart was a wild bird beating against the cage of her ribs, but she met his gaze. What do you want?" The words came out as a ragged whisper, but they held a spark of challenge. Correa's smile broadened, a mask of disarming charm. "I am something of a historian," he began, his tone conversational, friendly. "This place, it has a significant, if tragic, history. During the conflict, it was used as a temporary holding facility, a place of great sorrow for our nation. I have been petitioning the government for years to acquire the deed, to turn Storm's End into a proper memorial, a museum to honor those we lost." The hypocrisy was so profound, so audacious, that it stole the breath from Ilara's lungs. He was offering to build a memorial on the unmarked grave he himself had filled. The sheer evil of it was dizzying. With a theatrical sweep of his arm, he gestured at the damp, crumbling walls. "Clearly, this is no place for a respectable woman and her son. It's dangerously unstable. The structure is failing." He moved toward the cast-iron stove, his expensive shoes crunching on the debris-strewn floor. He pulled a thick, white envelope from the inside pocket of his jacket. With a deliberate, almost casual movement, he placed it directly on the lid of the stove, precisely on top of the spot where the secret flagstone lay hidden. The placement was no accident. It was a silent declaration. "I know. I am in control. I am prepared," he continued, his eyes locked on hers, "to make you a very generous offer for the deed. Enough for you to start a wonderful new life, a warm home, a good school for your boy, far away from here." The offer was a silken trap, baited with everything she desperately needed, but she could feel the cold steel of the jaws beneath. He was trying to buy her silence. Ilara's gaze dropped from his cold, assessing eyes to the white envelope on the stove. It was a stark, clean object in the midst of the ruin, pulsing with a malevolent energy. It represented a choice, a safe, comfortable future for Leo, an escape from the hunger and the cold. All it would cost was the truth. All it would cost were the ghosts. She could feel them crowding the room, their silent screams echoing in her soul. Maria, the teacher; Javier, the student; all the names in the ledger. Their only headstone was this secret archive, and he was offering her a fortune to help him bury it for good. In that moment, her own poverty, her own gnawing fear, seemed to shrink, overshadowed by the sheer scale of his evil and the immense weight of the truth she now carried. She felt a strange strength flow into her, a resolve forged in the cold fire of righteous fury. She was no longer just a desperate widow. She was their witness. She was their voice. Correa's mask of civility began to crack. A flicker of cold impatience crossed his features. He took a step closer, invading her space, and his voice dropped to a low, menacing purr that was far more terrifying than a shout. "This is a very lonely island, Ilara," he whispered, the sound a venomous hiss under the moan of the wind. "The rocks are slick with seaweed. The winter storms are brutal. The sea is so very deep." He paused, letting the implication hang in the air between them, thick and suffocating. "Tragic accidents happen all the time to people who are isolated, people who have no one to ask questions if they simply disappear. It would be a terrible shame if this island were to claim another victim." The threat was no longer veiled. It was a naked blade held to her throat. He turned, and with the same confident stride, walked out of the lighthouse, leaving the envelope, the choice, sitting over the hidden tomb. Ilara was left trembling, not just with fear, but with a terrifying, newfound rage. What would you do? Would you take the money and guarantee your child's safety, or would you stand and fight for the dead, knowing you might be the next to disappear? The lingering thrum of Correa's speedboat faded into the vast, indifferent roar of the sea, leaving a silence inside the lighthouse that was louder and more menacing than any storm. Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the sudden, oppressive quiet. Her eyes were fixed on the white envelope he had left on the stove. It sat there, a stark, clean rectangle against the orange rust, a symbol of a clean, easy way out that felt more like a tombstone. His final words echoed in her mind, the silken purr that held the sharpness of a razor's edge. Tragic accidents happen. It was not a threat, it was a promise. A cold, suffocating dread washed over her. The feeling of a steel trap snapping shut around her ankle. He knew about the cistern. He knew she had found the journals. The envelope wasn't an offer to buy the land. It was an offer to buy her silence, a down payment on her own oblivion. A violent shudder racked her body, a primal response to the predator who had just marked her as prey. She looked at the envelope, then at Leo, who had retreated into the deepest shadows of the room. His small face a pale mask of confusion and fear. The choice Correa presented was a cruel illusion. To take the money was to become his accomplice, to help him bury the ghosts of the disappeared under a foundation of blood money. It would mean feeding her son with bread bought by the souls of the dead, a communion that would poison them both forever. The thought was so repulsive it made her stomach churn with a fresh wave of nausea. A strange, cold fire began to burn in her veins, incinerating the last vestiges of her despair. He thought her weak, a pathetic widow, easily bought or scared away. He had no idea that by unearthing his secret, she had inherited the weight of all those lost lives. She was no longer just a mother fighting for survival. She was a witness, an unwilling custodian of a terrible truth, and the ghosts in the cistern were now her silent, demanding children too. The rage gave her a focus she hadn't felt in months. Her fear was still there, a cold, hard knot in her gut, but it was no longer in control. Action. She needed to take action. She could not stay here. This island, once a desperate refuge, was now a cage, and Correa held the only key. But where could she go? Who could she tell? The local authorities would be useless, likely already in the pocket of a man as powerful and connected as the general. He had called her isolated, and he was right. The realization was a fresh wave of cold dread. She was utterly alone, adrift on this rock with a secret that could topple a king or get her and her son thrown into the sea without a ripple. She needed to break the isolation. She needed a voice. She needed a weapon more powerful than the truth buried in the trunks. Her eyes scanned the debris-filled room, no longer seeing ruin but searching for a tool, for anything that might offer a way out of this perfectly constructed trap he had laid. Her frantic gaze fell upon a dusty crate in the darkest corner of the room, a corner she had avoided because of the thick cobwebs and the unsettling scuttling sounds she sometimes heard. It was filled with old equipment from the lighthouse's active days, rusted tools, coils of stiff rope, and a jumble of things the old keeper had left behind. Buried under a rotten canvas tarp was a boxy, metal object. It was an old shortwave radio, a relic from a bygone era, its black paint chipped and its chrome dials clouded with decades of salty air and neglect. A thick layer of dust covered it like a funeral shroud. It looked as dead and forgotten as everything else in the tower. Yet, a tiny, irrational spark of hope ignited in Ilara's chest. It was a voice box, a potential link to the outside world, a way to scream for help into the void. She felt a surge of desperate energy, the same gambler's instinct that had led her to the public records office, a feeling that this was her last, impossible chance. With trembling hands, she dragged the heavy radio from the crate, the metal cold and solid in her grasp. A cloud of dust billowed up, making her cough, the particles dancing in the slivers of grey light slanting through the cracks in the walls. It was heavy, a solid piece of machinery from a time when things were built to last. But would it work? There were no power outlets here, no electricity. Her heart sank. It was just another piece of useless junk, another false promise in this land of decay. Then she saw it. A thick, cloth-wrapped cable leading from the back of the unit to a set of heavy, blocky batteries, coated in a fine green dust of corrosion. Hope, fragile and tentative, returned. The old keeper, living in this profound isolation, would have needed a power source independent of the mainland. Maybe, just maybe, there was a flicker of life left in them. She held her breath, her fingers finding a switch on the front panel. It was stiff, resistant, as if fighting her. She forced the switch, and it clicked loudly in the silent room. Nothing happened. No hum, no light, no sound. Just the mocking whine of the wind outside. A sob of pure frustration and defeat escaped her lips. It was foolish. A stupid, desperate fantasy. She was about to shove the useless metal box back into its forgotten corner when she noticed a diagram etched into the side of the radio, a complex wiring schematic. One of the lines was labeled Auxiliary Antenna, External. Her eyes followed the faint trace of a wire leading from the back of the radio up the curved wall, disappearing into a dark crack near the ceiling. The old keeper had wired the entire tower to be a receiver. The thought was a jolt of electricity. It wasn't just a radio, it was part of the lighthouse itself. Renewed with a frantic energy, she began to twist the dials, her ears straining, praying for a sign of life, a single spark in the overwhelming static of her despair. For what felt like an eternity, the only sound was the hiss and crackle of an empty universe. Static filled the room, a sound of profound loneliness, the sound of a deadline. It was the auditory equivalent of the grey, endless sea outside. Ilara's shoulders slumped. She had failed. She was about to give up when her fingers, randomly twisting a large tuning knob, brushed past a certain frequency. The static changed. It shifted, thinned, and for a breathtaking second, she heard something else underneath. A voice. It was faint, distorted, buried under layers of atmospheric noise, but it was undeniably human. Her heart leaped into her throat. She frantically worked the fine-tuning dial, her movements clumsy with excitement, trying to catch the phantom signal. The voice faded in and out, lost in a sea of static. "Repeat. Anyone on this channel. Over." It was a ghost, a whisper, a possibility. "Hello?" she screamed at the radio, her voice raw. "Hello? Can you hear me?" The static answered her, a roar of indifference. Tears of frustration welled in her eyes. It was useless. She was talking to a dead machine. But she tried again, her voice a desperate plea. "Please, I need help. I am at the Storm's End Lighthouse." She spoke the name of the lighthouse like an incantation, a magic word she hoped could cut through the noise. She released the transmit button and waited, her entire world shrinking to the speaker grill of the radio, her breath held tight in her chest. The static hissed, a long, drawn-out sigh, and then a new sound emerged from the speaker, a gravelly, slow voice, laced with the same static, but clear enough to understand. "Storm's End. Who is this? Who is at Storm's End?" The relief was so absolute, so overwhelming, that Ilara's knees buckled. She sank to the floor, clutching the radio as if it were a living thing, tears of pure, unadulterated relief streaming down her face. She was not alone anymore. Someone had heard her. "My name is Ilara," she stammered into the microphone, her voice thick with emotion. "My son and I, we're trapped here. There was a man. He threatened us." She didn't know who was on the other end of the line, but a torrent of words poured out of her, a frantic, jumbled account of the last few days, of Korea, of the danger she felt pressing in on them from all sides. She didn't mention the journals or the cistern, a deep-seated instinct for caution holding that one secret back. The voice on the other end listened patiently, the silence broken only by the crackle of the connection. When she finally fell silent, exhausted, the voice spoke again, its tone calm and steady, a rock in the turbulent sea of her panic. "Don't you worry, miss. I know the man you're talking about. Stay away from the windows. I'm coming. My name is Silas." The line went dead, the static returning with a sudden finality. He was coming. The name Silas meant nothing to her, but his voice held a certainty that gave her a fragile shield of hope. The waiting was a unique form of torture. Every gust of wind sounded like the returning roar of Korea's speedboat. Every shadow seemed to coalesce into the shape of a man. Ilara paced the small, circular room like a caged animal, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, while Leo watched from a corner, his thumb in his mouth, a habit he had long abandoned. She tried to tell him it would be okay, that help was coming, but the words felt hollow and false in her own ears. The sun began to dip towards the horizon, painting the clouds in bruised shades of orange and purple, the dying light doing little to warm the cold stone of the tower. Darkness was coming, and with it, a new level of fear. As the last sliver of sun disappeared, she saw it, a tiny, flickering point of light on the vast, dark expanse of the water. It was a lantern on a small boat, bobbing and weaving with the swell, a single, courageous spark, challenging the immense darkness. It was heading directly for them. It was Silas. He arrived not with the aggressive roar of a motor, but with the quiet, rhythmic splash of oars dipping into the water. His boat was a small, battered dory, its wood worn smooth by years of work. The man who rowed it was as weathered as his vessel. He was old, with a face like a wind-beaten cliff, carved with deep lines and crevasses. A thick, white beard covered his jaw, and his eyes, when he looked up at her from the jetty, were the pale, washed-out blue of a winter sky. They were kind eyes, but they held a profound and ancient sadness. He moved with the slow, deliberate economy of a man who had spent his entire life on the sea, securing his boat to the crumbling jetty with a series of practiced, efficient knots. He carried the lantern up the path, its warm, golden light pushing back the encroaching shadows, and for the first time since setting foot on this island, Ilara felt the darkness recede just a little. He didn't look surprised to see her, only weary. He stopped at the doorway, his gaze taking in the squalor, the rusty stove, the frightened boy hiding behind his mother's legs, his eyes, filled with a deep, sorrowful understanding, finally met Ilara's. "The firewood," he said, his voice the same gravelly rumble she had heard over the radio. "That was me. I saw your light. Thought you might be needing it." The simple confession hung in the air, a small, profound revelation. This was her ghost, her mysterious benefactor, not a phantom, but this old, tired man. The flood of questions that had tormented her was answered with those few words. He was the guardian. He had been watching. "Why?" Ilara whispered, the single word encompassing all her confusion and fear. Silas sighed, a sound that seemed to come from the very depths of his soul. He looked past her, his gaze unfocused, as if he were looking back through decades of time. "I've been watching this place for 40 years, he said softly. "Waiting. I made a promise to my father." His words sent a chill down Ilara's spine, a premonition of the truth she was about to hear. "Your father," she prompted, her voice barely audible. Silas nodded slowly, his eyes finding the rusted stove, the epicenter of all the island's secrets. His name was Samuel Costa. He was a journalist in the capital during the dictatorship, wrote things the men in uniforms didn't like. One night, they came for him. The official story was that he ran away, abandoned his family. But we knew better. We tracked his last known movements. The trail ended here, at Storm's End. The name, Samuel Costa. It was one of the names from the journal. A wave of dizziness washed over Ilara. The ghost from the pages was this man's father. The abstract horror of her discovery suddenly had a face, a voice, a son who had spent a lifetime waiting on the shore, staring at the place that had swallowed his past whole. "I was just a boy," Silas continued, his voice thick with a grief that 40 years had not managed to dull. "But I never forgot. I never stopped looking. I became a fisherman so I could always be close, so I could watch this place. I knew something was here, a secret. My mother believed until the day she died that he was still alive somehow, that he'd be returned to us. But I knew, this island, it doesn't give people back." He looked at Ilara, his pale blue eyes sharp and piercing, filled with a new, urgent question. "Correa, you said his name. He was the captain back then, the one who ran this place. If he's come back here, after all this time, it means you found it. You found what my father left behind." It wasn't a question. It was a statement. The truth hung between them, a shared and terrible burden. The firewood had not just been an act of kindness, it had been a test, a baited line cast into the darkness of the past. And she had been the one to finally take it. Before Ilara could answer, to confirm the truth that was written all over her face, the world outside exploded. The wind, which had been a low moan, suddenly rose to a furious, shrieking gale. A blast of rain, hard as thrown stones, hammered against the tower. The sea, which had been a steady roar, became a thunderous, chaotic violence. The storm that Correa had so menacingly predicted had arrived, not as a metaphor, but as a raging actual physical entity. The entire tower seemed to shudder under the assault, the groans of the old stone and wood becoming screams of protest. The light from Silas's lantern flickered wildly, casting their faces in a macabre, dancing light. The storm was a monster, unleashed and furious, trapping the three of them on the island, cutting them off completely from the outside world. The fragile sense of safety Silas's arrival had brought was ripped away in an instant, replaced by a primal terror of the elements. And through the roar of the wind and the crashing waves, a new sound tore through the night. It was the high-pitched, aggressive whine of powerful engines, a sound that had no place in a storm like this. It was the speedboat. Ilara's blood ran cold. They were coming back. Not in a week, not tomorrow, but now, in the heart of the storm. This was no longer a game of subtle threats and veiled warnings. This was an assault. Silas grabbed her arm, his old hand surprisingly strong, and pulled her away from the doorway. "Get down!" he hissed, his eyes wide with an alarm that mirrored her own terror. The beam of a powerful searchlight cut through the rain-swept darkness, sweeping across the face of the lighthouse, a cold, probing finger of light that felt like a violation. It paused at the doorway, blinding them for a second before moving on. They were hunting. A voice, amplified by a bullhorn, cut through the gale, distorted and monstrous. "Ilara, the general is no longer feeling patient." The voice belonged to a different man, rougher, cruder than Correa. "You have 1 hour to bring the trunks to the jetty, all of them. If you are not there, we are coming in. We will burn this rotten tower to the ground with you and the old man and the kid inside it." The ultimatum was a death sentence, delivered with casual brutality. The searchlight beam swept back and settled on the jetty, illuminating the churning, white-capped water and Silas's small, battered dory being tossed about like a child's toy. They couldn't escape by sea. The threat was absolute. 1 hour. The number hung in the air, a ticking clock counting down to their extinction. The illusion of choice was gone. It was surrender or annihilation. The fear was so total, so paralyzing, that Elara thought her heart would stop. Her mind went blank, a white screen of pure terror. Leo began to cry, his small, frightened sobs nearly lost in the roar of the storm. The sound snapped her back to reality. She looked at Silas. The old fisherman's face was grim, his jaw set, but his eyes were not filled with panic. They were filled with a grim, calculating resolve. The years he had spent waiting, watching, had prepared him for this moment. He was not a victim. He was a warrior, whose battle had finally come. "He doesn't know," Silas said, his voice a low, urgent whisper close to her ear. The grandfather, the old keeper. He felt so much guilt for what he was forced to do. "He showed my father something, just in case. A way out. Not by sea, through the island itself. Hope, a desperate, wild thing, flared in Elara's chest. A way out? Where?" "The cistern," Silas breathed, his eyes boring into hers. "You found the trunks. You know the way. At the base of the foundation, there's another secret, an emergency escape tunnel. It leads to a sea cave on the north side of the island, a small cove that is sheltered from storms like this. The thugs in that boat, they won't know about it. It's our only chance." The plan was insane. It was a desperate gamble, a flight through the dark, unknown bowels of the island, but it was a chance. It was more than Correa had offered them. The sound of something heavy crashing against the main door above them, followed by splintering wood, jolted them into action. They weren't even waiting the full hour. They were coming now. There was no more time for thought, only for movement, for a blind, desperate leap of faith into the darkness Silas was offering. "Leo, come," Elara said, her voice shaking but firm. She grabbed his small, cold hand. "We are going to play a game of hide-and-seek, the most important game we have ever played." She looked at Silas, a silent question in her eyes. What about the evidence? The trunks were too heavy, too numerous. They couldn't possibly take them all. "You can't save all the stories," Silas said, seeming to read her mind. "But you must save the truth. Take one, the most important one, the one with his signature." Elara's mind raced back to the cold, musty air of the cistern, the transfer orders, the maritime disposal directive, the journals with the names. She knew exactly which trunk it was. It was the one on the bottom left, the one whose contents had made her physically ill. It was the one that contained the irrefutable proof of Correa's monstrosity. It was the weapon she would use to burn his world to the ground. While Silas used a heavy iron bar to wedge the broken main door shut, buying them precious minutes, Elara worked frantically at the flagstone. Her fingers were numb, clumsy with haste and fear. The rusted metal bar she had used before was her only tool. With a final, desperate heave, the stone tilted upwards, revealing the black square of the stairwell. The ancient, dusty air rushed up to meet them. Above, she could hear the heavy thud of boots on the stone floor of the lighthouse. Shouts, the sound of things being smashed and thrown. They were inside. They were feet away. "Go!" Silas urged, his face pale in the lantern light. "Take the boy. I'll hold them off as long as I can." Elara shook her head, grabbing his arm. "No! You come with us. You have to show us the way." The sounds of destruction from above grew louder, more frantic. They were searching for them. Searching for the entrance to the tomb. Silas hesitated for only a second, then nodded grimly. He knew she was right. He descended the narrow steps first, the lantern casting his long shadow back up the stairs. Elara helped Leo down, her heart pounding with a terror so profound it was a physical pain. The air in the cistern was cold and still, a shocking contrast to the raging storm and violence in the room just above their heads. The sound of their own frantic breathing echoed off the curved brick walls. The thugs were now directly above them, their heavy footsteps stomping on the flagstones, the sound muffled but terrifyingly close. One of them kicked the iron stove, and the clang echoed down into their hiding place like a death knell. Ilara could feel Leo trembling against her, and she pulled him close, whispering reassurances she did not feel. "It's okay, my love. It's just a game." "Here," Silas said, his voice a tense whisper. He ran his hands along a section of the brick wall at the far end of the cistern, a section that looked identical to all the others. Ilara held her breath as she watched his gnarled fingers search for something in the dark. Above, a triumphant shout. "They're not here! Check below! Look for a cellar!" The flagstone directly above them scraped as they tried to move it. They were seconds away from being discovered. Silas's hand stopped. He pressed a single brick, one that was slightly recessed. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a low grinding sound of stone on stone, a section of the brick wall, about 4 feet high, swung silently inwards, revealing an opening as black as pitch. The sound of the sea, a low, guttural roar, rushed out to meet them, along with a cold, wet spray that smelled of salt and deep, dark places. Ilara didn't hesitate. While Silas held the secret door, she scrambled over to the stack of trunks. She knew which one. Her fingers found the cold steel latches of the bottom left trunk. It was heavy, laden with the weight of paper and history, the weight of justice. She strained, her muscles screaming, and dragged it across the dusty floor towards the opening. Above, the scraping sound stopped, replaced by a furious hammering. They were trying to smash their way through the flagstone. "I can't hold it for long," Silas grunted, his old body straining against the weight of the stone door. "You have to go now. The passage will be dark, and it will be wet. Don't stop for anything. It will lead you to the North Cove. I will find another way and meet you there. Go!" He was sacrificing himself, trying to buy her time, but she wouldn't leave him, not after he had come for her. "No," Ilara said, her voice a fierce whisper. "We go together." She grabbed the rope from the trunk she had just opened, its original purpose forgotten, and looped it around a protruding stone near the secret door's hinge. She gave it to Silas. "Hold the door from the other side. They won't be able to push it open." It was a desperate, foolish plan, but it was all she had. Silas looked at her, a flicker of surprise and admiration in his old eyes. He nodded once, a grim acknowledgement. He scrambled through the opening. Ilara pushed the heavy trunk into the tunnel, then helped a terrified but silent Leo through the narrow gap. The moment he was clear, she squeezed through herself, her dress snagging on the rough stone. She turned just in time to see Silas pull the rope taut, the secret door swinging shut with a low, final thud, plunging them into absolute, terrifying darkness, just as the flagstone above them shattered. The blackness was total, a physical presence that pressed in on them from all sides. The only sensations were the cold, slimy wetness of the tunnel walls, the roar of the hidden sea ahead, and the frantic pounding of her own heart. Ilara could hear Leo's frightened whimpers beside her and the sound of Silas grunting with effort as he braced the stone door against the unseen blows of their attackers. The air was thick with the smell of brine and seaweed, the primal scent of the deep ocean. This was no man-made tunnel. It was a natural sea cave, a crack in the island's foundation that the old keeper had widened and hidden. They were inside the island's secret heart, a place of darkness and roaring water. The shouts of the men were gone, replaced by the overwhelming, thunderous voice of the sea. They were safe from their pursuers, but they had traded one danger for another, stepping from a hunter's trap into the very jaws of the ocean. "This way!" Silas's voice was a strained shout just ahead of her. "Keep to the left wall! The floor is uneven!" Ilara held Leo's hand in a death grip with one hand and clutched the handle of the heavy trunk with the other, scraping it along the rocky floor. The water was rising, swirling around their ankles, shockingly cold. It was the sea, pushing its way into the cave with the rising tide of the storm. They were in a race against the water, against time. Every step was a treacherous guess in the dark, her feet slipping on slick, seaweed-covered rocks. The tunnel began to widen, and the roar of the surf grew deafening. A faint, pale light appeared ahead, a ghostly grey luminescence that seemed impossibly far away. It was the mouth of the cave. It was their escape. It was a promise of a new dawn, or the cold, indifferent light of a world that would swallow them whole. The light grew stronger, revealing the cavern they were in. It was a vast, cathedral-like space, the waves of the storm crashing violently into the mouth of the cave, sending explosive plumes of white spray high into the air. The water in the cave was now up to their knees, a powerful, surging current that threatened to pull them off their feet with every wave. The trunk was an anchor, a dead weight trying to drag her down. Her muscles screamed, her lungs burned, but she refused to let it go. It was their only weapon, their only hope for justice. It held the voices of the dead, and she would not let them be silenced again. She could see the opening clearly now, a jagged maw of rock framing a scene of pure chaos, a churning grey sea under a black, starless sky. They were almost there. They were almost free. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, Ilara felt like she was running toward something, not just away. The wave crashed over the mouth of the cave, and a torrent of freezing, knee-high water surged around them, threatening to tear Leo from Ilara's grasp. She held fast, her other hand locked onto the trunk's handle, the weight of it a strange and terrible anchor. They stumbled out from the blackness of the tunnel onto a narrow, sheltered ledge of rock, the fury of the storm raging just beyond the protective arms of the cove. Her lungs burned, her muscles screamed. Every inch of her body a symphony of pain and exhaustion. Above the thunder of the sea, she heard Silas's ragged breathing behind her. They had made it. They were out. A sob of pure, unadulterated relief tore from her throat. And then, through the chaos of wind and water, she saw it, bobbing in the relative calm of the small inlet, Silas's dory, a small, dark shape with a single, steady lantern glowing like a star of hope. He had brought his boat around, gambling that they would make it through. Ilara felt tears, hot against her cold skin, as the old man helped her and a shivering Leo into the small, rocking boat. The world swayed, her strength finally giving out. The journey was a long, cold purgatory. Silas, his face a grim mask of determination, kept the small boat's chugging engine aimed not for the nearby coast, but out into the open, turbulent sea, charting a course directly for the distant glow of the capital. Ilara and Leo huddled under a stiff, oil-smelling canvas tarp, the only shield against the relentless salt spray and the biting wind. Ilara shivered uncontrollably, but it wasn't just from cold, it was the aftershock of terror. She held the trunk on her lap, its hard corners digging into her thighs, a constant, grounding reminder of their purpose. She refused to sleep, her mind a frantic slideshow of the journals, pages, of Correa's smiling, predatory face. She felt Leo's small, sleeping body pressed against her, his life a fragile flame she had almost allowed to be extinguished. As dawn broke, the grey light revealed the imposing skyline of the capital city. It was no longer a symbol of the uncaring world that had evicted her. It was a fortress, and she was arriving not as a beggar, but as a warrior, carrying the one weapon that could bring its most powerful citizen to his knees. They didn't go to a police station. Silas guided them through a labyrinth of clean, quiet streets to a formidable old building of granite and glass, the offices of the National Human Rights Commission. The air inside smelled of floor polish, old books, and a calm, quiet power that was the complete antithesis of the island's chaos. Ilara felt intensely out of place, her clothes still damp, her hair matted with salt, her son clinging to her hand with a frightened grip. A young aide led them through hushed corridors to a corner office overlooking the city. A woman stood to greet them, her hand outstretched. She was in her 50s, with sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing, and a severe haircut that framed a face of compassionate authority. "I am Isadora Vance," she said, her voice calm and clear. Silas called ahead. "Please, sit. Tell me everything." Her gaze fell upon the battered military trunk Ilara placed on the floor, and a flicker of profound, somber understanding crossed her features. She knew, even before the story began, that this trunk was Pandora's box. Ilara spoke, her voice starting as a tremor, but growing stronger and steadier with every word. The only sounds in the quiet office were her voice, the distant hum of the city, and the quiet, ragged breaths of Silas, who sat listening to the confirmation of a lifetime of grief. Isadora Vance listened without interruption, her expression a mask of intense concentration. When Ilara finished, a profound silence filled the room. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, Ilara knelt, her fingers fumbling with the cold steel latches of the trunk. The loud snap echoed like a gavel. She lifted the lid. The musty scent of aged paper and hidden history filled the sterile office air. She lifted out the first journal and placed it on the vast, polished surface of Isadora's mahogany desk. Then she added a stack of the official transfer orders, the faded ribbon crumbling. She watched as the prosecutor picked up a single sheet, the one authorizing maritime disposal. Isadora's eyes, cold and sharp as chips of ice, scanned the page before locking onto the arrogant, scrawled signature at the bottom. The mask of calm shattered, replaced by a cold, righteous fury. "My God," Isadora whispered, the words a prayer and a curse. She looked from the signature to Ilara, her eyes filled with a terrifying resolve. "You have brought me the ghost that has haunted this nation for 40 years. She didn't hesitate. She picked up her phone, her fingers dialing with a speed and precision that bespoke a person of immense power and purpose. Her voice was low, clipped, and radiated an absolute authority that sent a shiver down Ilara's spine. "It's Vance. Activate Protocol Gamma. I need a federal tactical unit. Sealed warrants. No local agencies are to be informed. This goes to the very top. The target is General Alistair Correa." The name was spoken like a shard of glass. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Ilara felt the crushing weight on her shoulders begin to lift. It was no longer her fight alone. The machinery of true justice, vast and powerful, was grinding into motion. A wave of relief, so potent it made her dizzy, washed over her. She clutched Leo's hand, feeling the warmth of his small fingers, and finally allowed herself to believe. The ballroom of the Grand Capitol Hotel was ablaze with light. General Alistair Correa stood at a podium, bathed in the adoring flash of television cameras, delivering a soaring speech on national integrity. The sound of polite applause and the clinking of glasses filled the air. He was magnificent, a silver-haired titan at the absolute zenith of his power. It was in that precise moment that the grand double doors at the rear of the ballroom swung silently open. The applause faltered. A wave of silence rippled through the crowd as two columns of elite federal agents, clad in black tactical gear, moved down the aisles with a chilling, silent efficiency. They parted at the foot of the stage, and Isadora Vance walked between them, her face set like stone. She held up a single document. "General Alistair Correa," her voice, amplified by the podium microphone he had just been using, was cold and clear as a funeral bell. "You are under arrest for the abduction, torture, and murder of citizens of this nation." A single camera flash illuminated his face, a perfect mask of charismatic charm shattering into a rictus of disbelief and pure, murderous rage. The arrest of General Correa was the spark that ignited a national firestorm. The contents of the journals were serialized on the front page of every newspaper, the neat, elegant script detailing a hidden genocide that horrified the public. The grainy photographs from the developed negatives, showing faceless figures being dragged onto boats at Storm's End, became the defining images of an era. The ensuing investigation, built upon the foundation of the old keeper's meticulous records, was a tidal wave that washed away a generation of corruption, exposing a network of complicity that reached the highest echelons of the old regime. Dozens of families whose loved ones had vanished without a trace finally had answers. At a special tribunal, Ilara took the stand. She was not the desperate, starving woman who had fled to the island. She was composed, her voice clear and strong, a vessel for the voices of the dead. Her testimony, alongside Silas's heartbreaking account of his father's disappearance, sealed Correa's fate and brought a painful, long-awaited closure to a nation's open wound. In the aftermath, Ilara was celebrated as a national hero. The newly formed provisional government, seeking to distance itself from the horrors of the past, held a special ceremony. In it, she was granted full, permanent, and uncontested ownership of Kailak Island and the Storm's End Lighthouse. But it was more than that. The state established a reparations fund for the victims' families, and in an unprecedented move, awarded Ilara a substantial portion of it, a sum so large it was abstract, a string of zeros on a page that made her head swim. She held the official bank transfer document in her hands, her fingers tracing the numbers. It was not the wealth that made her heart ache with a profound, shuddering relief. It was the absolute finality of it. It was the knowledge that her son would never be hungry again. It was the end of a lifetime of running, of scraping by, of fear. It was a foundation, solid and unshakable, upon which she could finally build a life of her own choosing. It was the quiet, breathtaking dawn after the longest night. The sun shone brightly on a transformed Storm's End. The lighthouse stood not as a skeleton of ruin, but as a proud, whitewashed sentinel, its stonework flawlessly repaired. The lantern room fitted with gleaming new glass that sparkled in the light. The air, once thick with mold and decay, now carried the clean, sharp scent of sea salt and fresh paint. Ilara stood on the newly constructed catwalk, a gentle breeze stirring her hair. Below, Leo's laughter echoed as he chased a butterfly through a garden of white roses that now surrounded the tower's base, a living memorial tended by Silas, who had become the lighthouse's permanent, peaceful curator. The mournful shriek of the wind through cracks had been replaced by the gentle, melodic chime of a memorial bell that hung at the entrance. The island was no longer a place of despair, but one of serene, quiet remembrance. It was a place of healing, a testament not to what was lost, but to the truth that had been found. Ilara felt a sense of peace so profound it was almost a physical presence, a warm hand on her shoulder. Inside the base of the tower, the cavernous, damp room was now bright and warm. The walls were lined with polished brass plaques, each bearing the name of a victim from the journals. In the center of the room, on a simple oak table, sat her mother's old Singer sewing machine. It was no longer a dusty monument to a failed life, but a tool of remembrance, its gentle, rhythmic hum a quiet counterpoint to the distant crash of the waves. Ilara's hands, no longer trembling with hunger or fear, steadily guided a strip of white linen under the needle, carefully stitching a name onto a vast collective tapestry of memory. She was no longer a widow adrift on a cruel sea, but the keeper of this sacred light, the curator of a history she had brought from darkness. She had faced the storm and the monster within it, and had emerged not just a survivor, but the architect of her own justice and the master of her own secure future. Do you believe that even in the deepest darkness, a single person can be the spark that ignites a fire of justice? If Ilara's story of resilience and redemption inspires you, subscribe now for more tales of courage against impossible odds.